The day-to-day problems of living in tower blocks have been carefully chronicled for more than 20 years. This film is not about those social problems. It's about the growing realisation that many of the blocks were not built properly. As a result, hundreds of them are potentially dangerous and may have to be demolished. This is an inquiry into the origins of that disaster and into how it was allowed to happen.
The only answer is more houses. The government are looking to increasing the productivity in the building industry and are basing all their plans during the following 5 years on reaching and maintaining a level of 400,000 houses a year.
With this speech, the then Minister of Housing, Sir Keith Joseph, is generally credited with starting what became known as the numbers game.
And here I come to a very strange omission from the socialist proceedings last week. In all their official speeches condemning us and our efforts, in all their official speeches, they never mentioned a target of their own. The Liberals at least disagreed about one. Their conference wanted 500,000 houses. The platform settled for 375,000 houses. But the Labour Party never had an official target at all. That seems very odd for a party that's so sure it can do better.
Britain is today being held to ransom by a small but unscrupulous group of land speculators and profiteers who are lining their pockets tax-free at the expense of local councils trying to rehouse overcrowded families and of young couples.
The Labour Party rose to the Conservative bait. A crucial part of their 1964 election campaign was the promise to build 500,000 houses a year. Labour won the election and Harold Wilson moved in triumph to Downing Street. He chose as Housing Minister one of the party's intellectuals, Richard Crossman, who now faced the unenviable task of turning a political promise into reality. Crossman appointed the Managing Director of Costains, the building contractors, as a special advisor. Together they pinned their hopes on a new and untried method of building.
It does, of course, mean factory-built houses, but factory-built houses can be just as good as production line cars. And I think we're going to move to this. The only thing is to make sure that they're done by good architects and well landscaped, and that will get over any danger of monotony. The main thing is you standardize the production. The whole of one wall is done in a single part, and you standardize down to, say, 20 or 22 parts. And then you put the house together on the site, having bought it, shall we say, by lorry. And once you get the thing going, of course, the factory built, they do come off jolly fast, and that means the local authority's got to get the gas ready, the electricity ready.
So you've got to realise that although the government made the promises in its election campaigns for 400,000 a year, 500,000 a year, and so forth, it wasn't the government that had to build them, it was the local authorities that had to build them. So the government then put the pressure on local authorities to take up these systems. And, of course, the government also put pressure on the major building contractors, who didn't need a great deal of pressing.
So many that only factory-made floor and wall units of precast concrete can keep pace with the scheduled program. So a new plant...
Sensing a huge new market, the contractors invested millions of pounds in production facilities, often before securing a single firm order. Their confidence was based on the knowledge that the government had introduced a system of subsidies to encourage councils to use industrialised methods and to build as high as possible.
The destination is the building site.
We'd always hoped that there would be a day when buildings could be more or less made in factories and they're just assembled on the site. So to us, this seemed as though the day had come at last. If the parts could be made in a factory where they would be under controlled conditions, where you could have proper inspectors, where you could have proper plant, as they did have, and then the only task then remained would be to assemble them on the site, obviously this seemed a straightforward thing to do.
In the present housing shortage, time is the essence of the contract, and so is money. The sector system...
Given the size of their investment, the contractors were also concerned with time and money. They sent out special teams of salesmen to travel around Britain. Part of their job was to entertain local councillors, usually in the best hotels, whose dining rooms began to enjoy a mini-boom of their own.
This hotel, of course, this particular type of room was typical of rooms all over the country, but all of the major contractors and most of the major professions, architects, engineers and surveyors, used to literally travel around every day of every week, and they were looking for people who had access to public contracts, of which at that time I was one. The local authority people, having to meet targets and having to get production, were facing a construction industry and the contracting industry, of which McAlpines were one, Laings were another, Costains were another, Wimpey's were another. Wimpey's used to be in here every day. I can't remember offhand the name of the guy. But his full-time job was entertaining and meeting local authority people. And then they also had the perks, the test matches. Wimpey's always, every test match series, used to have a marquee on the rugby side of the ground at Leeds. There were tickets to Ascot if you wanted to go, the boxes at Ascot. There were the precious Friday centre court tickets at Wimbledon.
T. Dan Smith succumbed to another variety of perk by joining John Poulson, the corrupt architect. Together they climbed aboard the industrialised building bandwagon, which by now had built up a momentum of its own. The systems on offer were so complicated that only the contractors and their engineers understood them. The controls and checks that councils normally exercised were almost useless. The contractor's package deal was everything.
The contractors were allowed to employ the architects, the quantity surveyors and the engineers and sell them to the local authority. That's what a package deal was. But the architects, if you like, they were like doctors protesting about witch doctors and allowing the witch doctors to practice. They were allowing contractors to organize the architectural and professional people to sell to the local authorities, and themselves weren't prepared to do it. And so the contractor, in fact, was the designer, the producer of the materials, and the supervisor of the job.
Faced by the contractors' newfound powers and by the government's massive subsidies, many councils felt they were being made offers they couldn't refuse. Nottingham Council agreed to build 2 huge developments costing £6 million.
I can remember very well taking them to committee and both schemes going through in something like about 2 minutes flat. The following scheme for something like a £2,000 toilet block was probably discussed for half an hour. But I was certainly, it's ingrained in my memory that these 2 schemes were disposed of so quickly by committee. Not that I expected committee to do any more, but I remember it well.
Do you think that's a criticism of the committee, or is it a reflection of the mood of the times?
A reflection of the mood of the times, undoubtedly. Get it built as quickly as possible, then think.
Princess Margaret's arrival in Woolwich marked a big day for the borough. The princess, accompanied by her husband, had come to perform the official opening of the new Tower Flats in the parish of St. Mary. The ceremony was simple, the unveiling of a tablet recording the occasion.
I was just starting my career in the 60s, and I distinctly remember the mood of optimism, the amount of money that was available, that was being spent on construction. New techniques were being tried. There was a lot of talk about plot ratios and how much per place it was costing, how quickly people were going to be rehoused in these new blocks. And I think people were swept along by the euphoria of the time.
Her Majesty, accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh, arrives to open a new housing development in the Gorbals of Glasgow. She met members of the Housing Committee who were responsible for the new facelift. It was a real day to remember for the Johnston family.
I think it was a general thing. I think architects, structural engineers, central government particularly, central government were very keen to encourage local authorities to build using industrialised techniques so that the main components could be made inside warm, comfortable factories.
Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon made it a day they'll never forget.
Sometimes it was only months after the excitement of the royal opening that the tenants found out what it was really like to live in system-built blocks.
The Princess and her
Their flats ran with water from condensation inside and from leaks outside. Eventually, many councils gave up on piecemeal repairs. They began to evacuate the tenants and demolish the blocks. So far, 10,000 flats have been knocked down, some of them only 15 years old. Thousands more await the same fate. Who is to blame for the scale of the present problem?
Well, it's very difficult, I think, to put blame on anyone. It is due to what we call innovation without development. Now, the pressure is on the designer, the architect, to provide the building that the client wants within the money that is available. Now, if he's going to try and do that, he wants to build it as cheaply as he can within the shortest possible time. So he's under pressure to innovate to try and achieve this. And the more you innovate without development, the greater are the risks. We have to compare this with other design situations like aircraft or products or cars, where there is considerable research and development before they are mass produced. And this, of course, is reasonable, because if you mass produce something and it fails, the consequences are enormous. Well, as far as buildings are concerned, most buildings, except for housing, are one-off. And if one fails, the consequences are less of a problem. But in mass-produced housing, as prefabricated housing, you may have thousands, and if there's a fault in them, there may be thousands of faults. And people didn't realize that unless you do the proper research and development, these enormous risks exist.
The implication of that is really that the system building blocks were tested out on local authority tenants.
Well, yes. I mean, the early examples were really, I suppose, the development situation of let's build some and see what happens. But that's a very costly way of actually undertaking development.
It's a very unfortunate way for the tenants as well, isn't it?
Very, yes.
The tenants, they were and are victims of circumstances which were abominable. I spent 3 years in prison in conditions that were as good as some of the ones that they were put to live in. They were never, ever designed multi-story flats for families. They were never designed to throw hundreds of people together, close in proximity, block to block, without open space. They were not designed for those purposes, and the fact that they were used for them is responsible for so much human misery that I thank the Lord that I had nothing to do with any of that kind of system building.
What do you think they were designed for?
Making money, and they made money in abundance. It was the best time that the contracting industries ever had.
But the real dangers of system building are only just beginning to emerge. Many were built like houses of cards. The blocks have no central frame. Instead, their whole strength rests on the bolts and fixings between the concrete panels. As councils demolish their blocks, they're finding that in many cases, those connections are just not there.